Hi, everyone. My name is Paige, and you are watching Elevate Filipino TV. It's the place where you want to be to discover possibilities, unlock your potential, and finally create a life and a business that you love. Joining me today is my dear friend, Krystl Fabella. Krystl is the host of the podcast Filipina on the Rise. And might I just say, it's more than just a podcast. It's a movement. Hi, Krystl. Welcome.
Oh my gosh, I'm so flattered. Hi, Paige. Thank you. What an intro. Thanks.
You
Love
weren't expecting that, hey?
I wasn't like, woo, wake up. It's morning. Thank you.
Yeah, well, you know what? I true like as a listener myself, I do see it as a movement more
Yeah.
than just a podcast. And when you're interviewing people on your podcast, you give them the stage to share their stories with you. And I'm so honored to share my platform so that you this time can share your story. So tell the audience, who is Krystl Fabella and what really gave birth to Filipina on the Rise?
Yeah. Thank you so much, Paige. I think the platform that you're creating is super important and also will, have so much impact for our community and beyond. I'm just very honored to be on here as well. I don't think it's every day I get to be asked questions and tell my story. That's what I do. So it's interesting being on the other side. And it's funny because I always ask people who they are and what they do. And this is the first time I've had to really answer this question, and it's a bit existential for me. But I would say I am a 1.5 generation Filipina who has a heart for advocacy, who has a heart for representation and justice. I feel very grateful for my multiplicity of backgrounds and upbringing. I was born in the Philippines. I grew up in Canada, so Canadian just like
Yeah.
you,
Oh,
and
yeah.
then had most of my formative years here in America. And so those are all parts of my identity.
Mm.
And they've all taught me one, how to be really grateful about being in a place with privileges and freedoms that were fought for me. So therefore, I feel very responsible and humbled by that to kind of further trailblaze and advocate for, other underrepresented communities and generations, Filipino generations to come.
Mhm.
So that is a lot of the fuel to the what I do in terms of doing things out of social impact, and a love for community and a love for justice.
Mhm.
I would also say that I am a producer and podcaster. That's it's weird calling myself that now. I do produce a show, and I've been building Filipino on the Rise. It was started a year ago. I had this frustration, this mini frustration while in an Uber because I was so desperately looking for stories on podcasts that I can resonate with.
Mm.
And it was just this tipping point for me of like, or this reflection, this lifelong frustration I've had of never seeing my faces in spaces, having a frustration with the lack of representation for Filipinas everywhere in media, in our education textbooks,
Mhm.
in different professions, and it became this personal prompt and calling for me of like, hey, while these stories aren't out there on these platforms, they're out there. Like, I know that there are Filipino women out there doing big things. Perhaps it's your responsibility and your calling to go find them and provide these stories. And I think there's something so powerful about storytelling. So my goal was really to create a narrative journey, and kind of this, like you said, movement
Mhm.
of spotlighting Filipina powerhouses around the world. And our mission is to elevate and promote Filipina excellence. So what does that mean? What does Filipina excellence mean? And so this is not just to empower our own community of women, but also to make a really bold statement to the whole world about what Filipinas are about. This is what we're capable of. We're not just on the sidelines. We're not just marginal. And we're not just happy Asian people who like to help and be team players. We are so much more than that. And we out here. So yeah.
I love that. I love that. And you mentioned that you were born in the Philippines, you
Yeah.
moved to Canada, and then now you're in the States. How old were you when you moved to Canada?
Yeah. So I was 4.
Okay. And when you
So,
moved to the States?
and I was, I think 7. So I was
Oh,
like,
okay.
about like, yeah. Yeah. So,
Yeah, that's very interesting. I mean, Canadians and Americans, there are still some differences there. And I do understand, like when it comes to, like, for example, Canada, we pride ourselves as being a multicultural country. But also there is always that talk about identity, about different cultures, and whether or not someone should express their cultural identity, or
Mhm.
if we should have this kind of like like a marker for what Canadian really is.
Yeah.
And so with what you're doing with Filipina on the Rise, I know one of the key things is your search for your own identity.
Hmm.
How did that affect, I guess, your adult life, having all those different backgrounds as
Yeah.
a kid?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And it's something I think I've recently just started to journey in terms of understanding my identity. I think when you do move to another country, you go to Canada and then you go to somewhere like America, your identity gets formed by the new country that you're in. And so the thing that I struggled with is I never felt fully Filipino. And then going to Canada, I never felt fully Canadian. And then here in the States, I quickly identified as Filipino American, but never knew what it meant to be proud to be Filipino. And I think I was intentional about assimilating and making sure I adapted well to the culture. So if the question was how did that kind of form my identity right now, it's interesting because I think for the longest, for a majority of my upbringing, I never felt very connected to my roots because I thought that you were either very Filipino or you were very American, and then there's this in between, Canadian Filipino or like Filipino American, this like gray area in between that because it's in between, we try to not define it, so you just don't know where you stand. And what is unique about Filipinos is that we are such a we are such a diasporic people. So we are everywhere in the world. So a majority of us are facing this in between
Mhm.
identity. And so for me, growing up, not being able to define that, I think it made me feel like I had to choose. And so what I chose wasn't very like I guess I'm not really Filipino. I grew up around Filipino cousins. I eat Filipino food. I did tinikling and I went to a Filipino church. But to me, it just meant being foreignized and othered. And I hated, I wanted to fit in and I wanted to kind of like feel more part of the country other than and I always felt like the Filipino community was really cliquey, and so those are things I wrestled with, and I realized that is so not true now, and it was just one part of the community. And I think with my identity right now, it's been really about embracing the multiplicity of identities that Filipino women can have. Everyone I've talked to on the podcast have had very similar experiences, where you're going to hear like growing up I never really fit in with my Filipino community, and I kind of I felt like I wasn't enough of this or the other, so I was just in between. So there's so many of us facing that, and so I think that's the route that I've decided to take with my identity of like, okay, I'm Filipino, but I'm also thankful to have been raised here in America. And so I'm Filipino American, and that is just as good. Like um,
Just as Filipino.
that is just as Filipino as it can be. And I'm trying to give that narrative back to us and redefining kind of like the narrative, the identities of Filipinas.
You know what, Krystl? When you were sharing that story, I was trying to not well up because I feel like you unearthed something that I haven't really put into words. So when you said, you didn't really feel Filipino enough or not even Canadian enough when you were here, you were sort of in between. I never really thought of it that way. And, like just a little backstory, my husband and I, we've been traveling and moving across Canada because we're finding that home
Yeah.
where we want to raise our kids. But there's always that kind of like something's kind of holding us back because I don't 100% feel like I'm part of that community, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And when you had put that into words, it unearthed something
Yeah.
that was uncomfortable but is a reality for a lot of us. And I'm just so grateful
Yeah.
that you brought that up. it was
Mm-hmm.
in the shadows and people don't like to talk about it, but now we're talking about it.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I think we always feel like we have to choose one or the other. And this is something I learned from another podcast of mine, Gabe's Torres. She said, we have this binary, like with this, we grow up like thinking we have to be in a binary of like, you're either here or you're over there, and anywhere in between, you feel so undefined and you feel like a loss of identity. But that in between is exactly who you are, like, and what we are. So yeah, I think embracing that is so important. So yeah, thank you.
So I'm curious to find out, before you started your podcast, you had this image, or I guess like a perspective as to what passes as Filipina. And then there's a perspective now of what Filipina really means. Could you share with us the difference?
Yeah, to me, growing up, Filipina meant you. It meant, you went into a stable career path like nursing and healthcare, and that you were very surrounded by a lot of family and cousins, which I love. It's really great. You didn't really rattle the cage. You didn't try to disrupt status quo. You came to America, you were a first or second generation immigrant, and you learned what you could about Filipino culture from maybe Filipino club, or maybe from different heritage, like cultural things. But you're not taught about Filipino history education at school. So you don't really know much about being Filipino. Maybe you go back to the Philippines and visit your homeland. Oh, wow, this big awakening. Like, wow, this is Philippines. This is the homeland. These are my people. And then that's exactly what happened when I visited very recently and started um, to go to museums and started to learn about our own activists and our own Filipino freedom movements. And so you start to realize like there's something back in my homeland that I could be part of. How do I marry the two? Like, how do I now incorporate this in my own identity and what I could be proud about? Because I didn't grow up here, but in America here, I'm not taught to really feel proud about what it means to be Filipino American. Like, I feel like I can't own what the white founding fathers did. Like, so how do I marry the two? And now I realize being Filipino is exactly that journey of being proud about what cultural traditions have embedded in us, which is adaptability, resilience, which is being people persons and being so hospitable. We took that with us wherever we go, but also being very educated on our history of resilience due to so many forms of colonization and oppression. Because once we understand that, then we learn that we have a lot of resilience in our blood. And then that's something that we can be proud of. And so wherever we're at now, the new Filipino identity is truly like, well, where did you grow up? What community did you grow up in? And how did that influence you as well? And I think that is so different for everybody. It's literally so different for every Filipino and every Filipino that I've talked about. But what is the common denominator is that we are so proud about what our people, our unique traits about the Filipino people. I think everyone can say Filipinos are the most warm. We're very happy. We find a way to laugh through every hardship and trial. This is literally what I know everybody is proud about for ourselves. We try to see the bright side of things all the time. Like, how do we do that through so many like forms of colonization and oppression? Like, we've just chosen to always be optimistic. A lot of us are very spiritual. A lot of us find family with everybody. We find a way to look at other people and kind of consider them brother and sister. And that's why I think a lot of Filipinos go into things like nursing, because we are that kind, like, that's what's so unique about us. And so I would say that the Filipina now has a multiplicity of identities, and that's our running thread. and something we could be proud of.
Yeah, that's wonderful. And, like we can all relate to that multiplicity of a certain identity because, like you said, you don't have to be just black and white. Like
Yeah.
as a kid, we grow
Yeah.
up, it's like black or white, yes or no, right or
Yes,
left, right?
exactly.
But there is that path in between, and it doesn't mean that you're neither,
Yeah.
right? Or that you're lost. It just means it's
Hmm.
who you are, right?
Yeah, I love that you said that because I just remembered a quote from Krystl Fabella. She is the founder of TRT Ice Cream,
Mhm.
another podcast episode, and she instilled like just because you don't know where you're going, it doesn't mean you're lost,
Mhm.
and that's been something that's been so true for me these days because I also think we're in such uncertain times. We're just like, where are we all going? And so, but I don't think we're lost. So,
So I know that one of the things you're very passionate about is justice for everyone, especially for those who are underrepresented.
mhm.
Now, for us here living in Canada and in the US, for example, the Black Lives Matter movement it's pretty big here on this side of the world. But we do have viewers who live in Australia, who are, in the Philippines, who don't really like, I've asked them, is it a big thing there back at home? And
Mm.
it's not really an issue that's often talked about, but obviously because we know that a lot of our traits are not necessarily connected to your home country or
Yeah.
to your I guess not home country but residential country,
Yeah.
right? A lot of it is cultural. Let's shed some light into
Yeah.
something that's very uncomfortable to talk about, right?
Mhm.
And which is all about racism. um,
Yeah.
how can we bring to light certain, I know this is going to be a difficult conversation, a lot of facing yourself and, like, oh my gosh, realizations that maybe we don't
Yeah.
even know, right? But what are some cultural traits of Filipinos that would, could be deemed as, say, racist, for example?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a really important and hard, like in a good way, question. And I think we do need to talk about it because I think that there is, and I like that you bring up that a lot of the experiences we face are cultural based off of the country that we're in. Because yes, like Canada or like let's say Filipino Australians or something might not understand that same um, complex that we're going through here in America with like Black Lives Matter and the movement for racial justice and stuff. But I do think that there is something internal and common within the Filipino community that we have that we are coming face to face with, and that is internalized racism and internalized anti-blackness. And this dates really way back, right? Centuries. And I think we need to get very real with it. If we truly want to call ourselves allies and we want to say we stand for like what's right and justice, we need to get real with ourselves first. And this has become very highlighted, especially with the Black Lives Matter movement. So before I answer your question, I just want to say what I've been seeing and why this conversation is important. Because with the recent, murders of Black lives, there's been this nationwide movement calling for justice, calling for reform, and we've seen who is joining that movement and who isn't. And there's a lot of Asian Americans who have been in solidarity and allies to this community, but especially the Filipino American community, um, I'm very proud that a lot of us are taking a stand and moving forward. But what happens is when you go back to our own communities and our own households and our families, there's this huge discrepancy in dialogue between what of a lot of the younger generations and the older generations. And that is, I'm just going to say it's anti-blackness. It's older folks saying like, why are they protesting? That is so like disruptive. Why can't they just be happy with what they're at? They're thugs, they're looting. We came here to this country. We don't demand more. We don't complain. That's a big thing. A lot of them are just lazy. Like you just hear a lot of that, and it pains my heart but something I've learned, especially from a recent podcast talk that I had, is that we have our history uh, centuries back, our political and history, our political history, our history of oppression and power have conditioned the Filipino people to expect, I guess, backlash for political uprisings, and to be to like be, I guess, safe, and to not speak out. Otherwise, there was very serious consequences. And so I think that conditioning is passed down generations. So we have to be very sympathetic when talking to older generations about how they were brought up and what kind of regime oppression they saw or learned about. Here in America, it's very, a rich part of our history is activism. It is a lot of movement about social change. And so when you have a lot of these first generation immigrants coming here, we are taught to be what's called politically apathetic because we just want to survive and we're just trying to build a life for our family. So being very, I guess, empathetic and understanding about that. But at the same time, we need to start dismantling internalized racism and anti-Blackness in our communities, because, to be honest, that is what it's going to take to dismantle racism everywhere. You need to start within your own selves, right? I've actually heard that the Black community is actually, that's what they're asking us. Like, a lot of people are asking, like, how do we help? How do we help? Like, yes, sometimes it's in the streets. Sometimes it's, voicing out on social media. There's a time for that, but the ask is actually to start talking within our own communities in the same way that we ask, white folks to be allies and talk with other white people to help them because it's like you start to change your mind more when it's coming from your own folks. And so, like, I believe that is what we're called to do right now. It's hard conversations. It's difficult, but yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, just to, for those who may not be living in the States or in Canada, really, if you look at our culture, we have like our image of what beauty is, right?
Yeah.
Very westernized, right? The perspective
Totally.
of beauty is very westernized. We have a ton of whitening soaps
Yeah.
everywhere, right? And another big thing I know, like often people would say, "Oh, like I remember growing up, oh, don't go in the sun, go under
Fun.
the
Yeah.
shade because you don't want to get dark," right? And it sounds kind of silly, but it really is very, like what you said, it's internal racism.
Yeah.
And sad to say, like, I mean, I just want to share some personal stories. Even actually here abroad, obviously there are Filipinos that kind of, that they group together, they still spend time with one another. But there's also another side of Filipinos that I've seen personally where they like to talk crap about other Filipinos, right?
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
for example, like, I don't know, like, oh, Filipinos are like, I've heard Filipinos themselves saying bad things about other Filipinos.
Mm-hmm.
And they kind of just assume it's a cultural thing, right?
Yeah.
And yeah, definitely having that difficult conversation where we have to realize that we have certain attitudes and perspectives that
Totally. Yeah.
need to start changing if we really want to implement change.
I love that. I love that you said that because it's made me reflect on what, when I say like, oh, we need to start with our own people and like look back. It's, this time has actually made me do a lot of internal reflection about how thoughts that I've had growing up and like things that we've been conditioned to believe growing up that have, where I have internalized racism. So I was just talking about like our community needs to change and like our older generation needs to change. Like I need to change too. Like I, for the past 3 months more than ever, have started to really backtrack of like, oh, wow, that's still some internalized racism or discrimination that I have, which is rooted in things like when you grow up, like you are taught like this is ugly. This is what you reject. You reject darkness, brownness. This is beauty. Beauty is assimilation. Beauty is like, whiteness or something like that. And you have to reject these sides. And so I've been doing a lot of self-auditing, I guess, when it comes to my own internal biases and just like with other people. Like you catch it. Like you can catch it when you look at another person who's different from you and what reflex thoughts come up, whether it's like a Filipino, like sometimes for me, it's like, oh, she has a thick accent, Filipino accent. Oh, she's not as like educated or assimilated. Like, why did that thought come up? Oh my gosh. Or like, oh, this person is really brown. Like all of a sudden, this person is a little like, I don't know, like I have these impulses of like thinking like lower class or poor. And I'm like, I hate that. Like, why do I have that reflex? Like, oh, that's rooted from back when we thought that darker meant dirty and poor. Okay. Like, so it's these like things that we have to start getting real about that we have in ourselves. And so I appreciate that you mentioned that, because I always talk about like changing the system and changing our community, but it's like changing the self is so important.
And one of the important things, I bring this up because unfortunately I have family members who are actually like, just a tidbit. I was telling a very close family member, in case they're watching, I'm just not going to say, but I remember saying, hey, I plan on speaking on the TED stage one day, and except I don't think you'll be proud of what I'm going to talk about. And
Ooh.
when this person asked, well, what is the topic? I said, it's about being proud to be Filipino. And this person said, oh, yeah, I don't know about that. But
What?
they're Filipino, okay? So this
Yeah.
family member is Filipino. And for me, like, I had that conversation because I'm always trying to think about how can you serve others in a
Mm,
way that, obviously when you serve others, you give your all, right? Like you're 100%. But how can you do that if there's a part of you that you can't even accept,
mm,
right?
yeah.
And so like this conversation about race, it's bring to light some of the things that we have as a culture that we sometimes don't like about ourselves,
Yeah.
because it's not our fault. It's
Yeah.
generation and
Yeah.
generation of colonization.
I like that you said that. Like it's not our fault and we have to get real with that, because no one's trying to put guilt or blame on you. What we're doing is like holding the mirror up to ourselves, and getting very real about like what our history and what our culture has taught us, and not shaming ourselves for it, just like moving forward. I'm very curious though, when you said like, oh, I don't know about, like you said your family member said like, I don't know about that. Like what was that sentiment from?
They're actually not proud to be Filipino.
Why? I've heard
Yeah.
that. So
Yeah.
what, like in that very like way, like we don't do that.
Well, I often talk about like Filipino. So I've recently, I'm
Mhm.
doing this project about
Yeah.
Elevate Filipino, and I remember they're just like what you said. They don't resonate because
Hmm.
they live here in Canada. They don't feel
Yeah.
like they're Filipino enough,
Yeah.
and just what you mentioned,
Yeah.
they sometimes feel like it's cliquey. Other Filipinos just kind of like they have groups where it's just
Yeah.
only Filipino, so they can't penetrate or join this group, and
For
they
sure.
therefore feel like they're
Feel
not
like
part of
not part of it, ostracized. Exactly. Almost this feeling of like, well, why do I want to be part of that anyways?
it.
And on that point, like honestly, growing up, when I say that I didn't know how, like, why to feel proud to be Filipino. So it was something I kind of rejected. It was like, there's nothing here for me. Like, there's nothing proud about our history. Like, I might as well just try to assimilate. And it's sad, but it's also like, I think what's important is that you realize that and you grow from it. Right. And then you start to like see like how you can feel proud about, and trying to change the dialogue around that, which is like what you're doing. I think what I'm doing too, one example of why I'm doing this and my approach to it is that I have a little sister, and she one day told me, she's like, yeah, like I asked her, I was like, hey, do you know why you should be proud to be Filipino? She's like, no. And I was like, well, what about you and your friends? You have a lot of Filipino friends. Like, do you guys know? And she's like, no, honestly, like at school, it's cool to not be too Filipino, because then it's just like it's boring or like whatever, like it doesn't
You're
make
like with the
sense.
cooler kids.
Yeah, you have to like be with the cooler kids. And it just brought me back so much when I was in school and like I tried to hang out with like the white kids or like the other multicultural kids and everyone but Filipino because it was just like I don't want to be part of like this cliquey like foreign or group or whatever. And so that really woke me up and said like, hey, our younger generation, they need to know they have something to be proud of.
Mhm.
They have to know that they have it in their blood to be proud about who they are and their skin color and their heritage. And so yeah, I think that's something that we're changing, I believe.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. And I know that's one of the big mission you have with your podcast because, you mentioned to me before on our call before this interview was that you were looking at magazines and, images of successful people,
Yeah.
and none of them look like you.
Hmm.
And
Yeah.
yet, with your podcast, you have what, like over 180, segments now. And these are Filipinos who are making a difference in wherever country they are and in different areas and industries.
Yeah. Yeah, that was the most important part was capturing Filipino representation in every industry. To be honest, a lot of it, like a lot of projects we start, it's born out of before it's a service project, it's a selfish project, right? Before before it's for others, it's actually completing us. And for me, that frustration was like growing up, okay, I never felt like I fit in with a certain path, a profession. Like everybody kind of knew they wanted to go into healthcare, medicine, law, whatever. I did so many different things. I didn't want to do nursing. I knew I didn't want to go into medicine, but I went to college doing that. And I think once I finally accepted that, like, okay, maybe I'm not I'm not like the traditional Asian that my parents could be proud of because I want to go in these fields. I just started exploring other industries and it frustrated me seeing the lack of Pinay representation. But here and there, whenever I did see a Filipina, we know this feeling. Once you see a Filipina, you're just like, you like zoom in on them and you're just like, oh, they're Filipina. You just know,
Oh, yeah.
and then you're just like, what's their story? What did they do? Because like, somewhere in them, they had some similar upbringing. They ate pandesal. They were called like we're talked to in Tagalog. There's just that like that you want to feel like you belong and you feel that resonance. And so I realized that feeling was so powerful. So I was like, if I just find more Filipinas who are at the top in some industry, whatever it is, I think it's going to start building the confidence and affirmation in me that I belong somewhere and that I have it in me to be a risk taker and to be a leader in whatever profession I want to. And so that was selfish at first, right? But then when I started searching and finding these other Filipino women, and I was like, holy crap, there's so many of us doing big things and being trailblazers in these different fields. And I started presenting these stories to other people. Then I started getting all this feedback and inbox of like, oh my gosh, I never knew that there's a Filipino in the design world. That's where I want to go. I feel more empowered to do that now. I listened to this story about the Filipino government, and this girl literally said because of that episode, I applied for the next level in her government in the city hall position, and she got it. Yeah, and like I never knew that Filipinos were doing this in this field, and now I want to read, and like they reached out to them, and I'm like, this is why it's a movement because it's the effects are exponential because what happens is like you just hear one story, you feel representation, you feel belonging, you feel called to go in it. Now you're in it, and then now other Filipinos are looking to you, and they also feel more empowered. So it is this movement, and it just starts with the power of storytelling and representation.
Oh my gosh, there's so many things that I want to keep talking to you about. And I know that we're trying to keep this segment short.
Yeah,
So
sorry.
pass. No. I honestly want to keep chatting here. But before we wrap up this segment, what's your parting message to our viewers?
Yeah. Oh, that is a good one. My parting message to viewers is, let me think about this really quick. Yeah, I would say my parting message is built on the takeaways that I've had from my many podcast interviews, which is one, if you feel called to start something, um, you have the resources and then you have the community you need to do that. You don't have to wait to feel more ready. Like you are ready now with what you have around you. You don't have to go in a stable career for 10 years to finally maybe it's your passion. Like if you feel passionate about something, just start it. You have the tools that you need to. I started with just a recording on my phone, and one person that literally said like, you need to do this. Like start with what you have and curate people around you who believe in you, and you'll be able to, you could do it. Filipino on the Rise, like it grew in less than a year, and it has almost 10,000 listeners and followers and downloads. And I started off with a phone and GarageBand. Like it's really simple. You can start wherever you're at. We're Filipinos. We're so scrappy. We're so resourceful. You don't need to buy an expensive course. You don't need to go to school for it. You don't need to have your whole family backing and supporting and funding you. You can start with wherever you're at, because all you need to really do is keep reaching out to your fellow Filipina female community, and people will prop you along the way. People are so supportive in this community. So supportive. And then second, this is my last parting message. Like this is a belief that I've had. I first thought that my mission was to elevate Filipinas so that we can empower more Filipinas to go after their wildest dreams. But I realize now it's actually also that I fully believe that if more Filipinas stepped into their calling and their passion, we have the ability to actually like change the world. Like I know that's really radical, but it's because what I've seen from the common traits of Pinay leaders, we're adaptable, we're compassionate, we can shift and pivot so fast, we're so scrappy, we're so resourceful, we're so inclusive, and we know how to communicate, we know how to look at the big picture, and we are servant leaders. And so if we put ourselves more in leadership around the world, like I think a lot of injustices would die, and I think a lot of oppression and systematic barriers would start to be dismantled. I truly think that with more Filipinos rising, like we could literally change the world. That's what I think.
I am getting goosebumps. I'm trying to rub my leg here because I'm getting goosebumps hearing that.
So
Guys, I'm personally a listener of the podcast, and I wish that you would join this movement. Support us by being a listener and following Krystl in all her social media platforms. There's definitely a lot of golden message here that you can learn, not just from us, but she's got a ton of other Filipinas who share their stories with you, and take that and apply that in your life. And once again, if you love this segment, please go ahead and share this with your friends and your loved ones so that we can all rise together and be elevated Filipinos. Thank you so much for watching, and thank you for joining.
I love it. Thank you so much, Paige. It's just so great. I'm so honored and appreciative of you and all the work that you're doing. Thank you.
Thank you.